In the winter of 1735, a small group of settlers left Burlington, heading deep into the Pine Barrens with a wagon of supplies and a map to new land. The woods were silent, the nights colder with each mile. Then came the cry, high, distant, not of any creature they knew. By dawn, cloven tracks circled their camp, sunk deep into the frozen earth. They kept moving, but something was following them through those woods, and it was getting closer. So, before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We left Burlington at first light in late November with a wagon, 2 horses, and a plain purpose. Mr. Hargreaves had a deed to a tract near the Mullica and wanted cedar for shipbuilding. He hired me to survey a line from the ferry road toward Batstow, and we agreed to carry a chest of nails to the forge and see a widow, Ruth Lanning, safely to her sister near Leeds Point. Malin Pride, a local who knew the sand roads, walked ahead with a staff and kept the pace even. Owen Reese, a carpenter with a stout back and a short temper, handled the team. We expected 4 days through pine and swamp, then 2 days back by a different route if the streams allowed it. The air stayed cold through morning. The sand under the wheel tracks was loose and pale. The horses labored and blew white breaths. The pines stood close with short needles and dark cones. We crossed a low place where cedar water ran brown and slow. It smelled of iron and rot. Frogs were quiet. A thin mist lay in the hollows, and I kept the chain dry by looping it over my shoulder when we forded the shallow runs. My hands felt stiff around the staff. I told myself to keep good notes. The deed called for a marked white oak that no one had seen in 20 years. I trusted distances more than old trees. We met a charcoal burner near a mound of ash and sticks. He wore a cap pulled low and had hands the color of soot. Malin spoke for us. The man warned us the bog at Quaker Bridge had taken a cart the week before. He told Ruth not to pass Leeds Point after dark. He did not explain. She thanked him without fear. She said she had walked those roads as a girl and had family there still. Owen leaned from the wagon and asked about timber. The burner pointed east with the end of a rake. "Plenty," he said. "Watch for the ground. It is not firm." He went back to his work and did not look up again. By noon, the sun had no warmth. We ate cold pork and hard bread at the edge of a cedar stand. Ruth kept to the wagon and drank a little cider. She was older than the rest of us, with gray hair pulled tight and a steady gaze. She spoke little, but when she did, I noticed that Owen listened, and even Malin paused. Mr. Hargreaves rode behind on a small mare he had bought for cheap. He watched the trees and made a list under his cloak of what he believed he owned. He said there would be a mill and a dock, and that ships could cross the bars if the channels were cut. He said it like a man talking to himself. The road became 2 ruts with brush in the center. I measured a mile and set a tally in my book. I marked a pine with 3 cuts on the north side, then another with 2 on the east. The woods did not change. The trunks held the same color, the ground the same light sand, the same scattered cranberries near wet places. Small birds jumped from branch to branch. A vulture turned once and glided away. The air stayed still. My senses dulled to the sameness, and I forced myself to count steps between stakes so I would not drift. We reached a clearing before dusk with a collapsed shed in one corner and a ring of stones where someone had once cooked. Malin said we would stop there. The shed roof sagged toward the ground. The boards smelled of damp. We tied the horses and gave them feed. Owen set a small fire with dry twigs under a leaning plank to break the wind. Ruth cut a few thin slices of pork and warmed them. The others spoke in low voices about routes and fords. I wrote down distances by the firelight and checked them twice. I felt a steady calm from the work. Numbers did not care about empty land or old warnings. When the dark came fully, it came at once. The trees formed a tight wall around the clearing. Our fire lit our faces and the first few trunks. Beyond that, there was only a dark shape. We heard water somewhere past the shed. We heard a fox bark once and then go quiet. Malin told a short account of a man who had gone into a cranberry bog and sunk past his waist before he could throw his pole across the moss. He carried on without any flourish. He said to test the ground and watch for places with green over black. Owen said every place looked the same to him in this country and he did not trust it. Ruth said sameness hid small signs and to keep our eyes on the small signs. Near midnight, a sound ran through the trees that I could not place. It was thin and high and held steady for a count of 3 and then cut off. It was not a fox. It was not an owl. We sat still without speaking. Owen lifted a hand toward the fire without looking away from the trees. Malin stood with his staff raised like a spear. Mr. Hargreaves said nothing. The horses shifted and stamped. After a time, the sound did not return. We settled again. I told myself it was a bird I did not know. I slept in my cloak with my chain under my arm. I woke twice to the shift of hooves and the creak of the wagon. I lay still until the sounds passed. In the morning, frost lay on the boards and on the grass at the edge of the clearing. The horses had pulled at their ties and left deep prints. I walked a circle to the shed and back and found tracks I could not read. They were cloven, but the spread was wide and the stride was long. The ground was hard enough to hold shape. The prints ran from the trees to the far side of the clearing and ended near a rotted stump. There was no return. I called Malin and Owen over. Malin crouched and ran a finger in the edge of one print. He did not speak. Owen said, "Deer." I said the stride was wrong. Malin asked me to pace it. I paced 12 feet from one mark to the next deep one, with lighter dimples between. I felt the hair on my arms stand, though the air had grown warmer. Ruth came to look and did not step into the line. She asked if we had heard the sound again. We had not. She said to keep moving. Mr. Hargreaves came last. He peered down, frowned, and told me to mark the day and place in my book, and then he told everyone there was work to do and little time for tracks. We broke camp and pushed the wagon onto the road. I checked the shed once more. On the inside of a still-standing wall, the boards were scratched, with lines running downward from high up, higher than a man could reach without standing on something. The wood was fresh scarred and pale against the dark. I did not call the others. I took one look at the height and then at the open door and decided there was nothing to gain from more eyes on it. I kept it to myself and watched the trees more closely. We made poor time that day. The road split and joined again without any sign of which part saw more wheels. Malin chose by smell and by the quick look he gave to the ground. He said one branch ran towards Salt and the other inland. He kept us inland. I took bearings when the sky cleared and tied my angles to what I had measured. We crossed a stream where iron stained the sand. The horses drank and lifted their heads with brown water trailing from their mouths. Ruth washed a pot and held it to the light. She wiped the inside and frowned at the fine grit that remained. Owen pulled a nail from the chest to show me its shape. He said the forge master would like the weight. He slid it back into place and drove the hasp hard. I watched his hands. He did not notice that my gaze had moved past him to a broken branch 8 feet up with sap wet on the splintered end. By late afternoon, the air turned sharp again. We came upon a small farmstead with no smoke from the chimney and a fence in poor repair. A single pig lay in the pen on its side. It did not move. Owen called out. No one answered. We waited at the gate until it felt wrong to wait more. Ruth asked to see the pig. Its throat had been torn. The wound was clean and deep. There were marks around the pen where something had pressed into the ground and tore up sand. The prints were not clear enough to study, only scoops and edges. Malin looked toward the house and raised his palm. We did not go inside. He said the owners were likely at a neighbor's or at the mill, and we lacked time to seek them. We left a stick across the gate to show someone had passed and moved on. Dusk came while we were still a mile from Quaker Bridge. We did not want the bog by dark, so we turned off before the low ground and made camp on a patch of higher sand with scrub oak and small pines. I kept the fire modest and set my bed near the wagon wheel. The others rested with their backs to the glow. The night carried sound in a plain way. We heard an owl. We heard a distant splash. Then we heard the thin call again, higher than before and closer. It rose, held, and cut off as if a hand had closed over it. Owen swore once under his breath. Malin stood and faced the dark without moving. Mr. Hargreaves pretended to sleep and did not. Ruth sat up straight and put her hand on my arm. She did not squeeze. She did not speak. I counted 20 in my head and did not reach the end before a shape crossed the portion of sky I could see between the crowns of two pines. It moved fast. I saw the line of a long body and the angle of wings. It vanished. No leaves shook. The air did not stir. I stood without meaning to and stepped closer to the edge of the firelight. I felt exposed and wrong there. I went back to the wheel. I told myself to be ready to move before dawn. We broke camp before first light. The fire was only embers. Malin led with the staff and kept his feet to the center of the ruts where the sand held best. The horses moved without eagerness but did not balk. The cold helped the ground. Our breath showed in short bursts. I counted paces to steady my thoughts and kept my book shut. Owen checked the harness twice and muttered about the left trace. Mr. Hargreaves rode close behind the wagon and tapped the chest once with his boot, as if to confirm it stayed there. Ruth wrapped a shawl tight and watched the trees on the right side without turning her head. As the sky paled, the road dropped toward lower ground. The air took a sour smell that came with bog water. The trees thinned and then closed again. We heard small flows under the moss. A plank span came into view through the mist. Quaker Bridge, narrow, with side rails set with crude pegs. The stream below was slow and brown with a skin that tore when a stick touched it. The far bank rose a little and looked firmer. Malin tested each plank with the staff. He said to keep to the center and not to stop once the team set foot on the bridge. Owen climbed down and walked at the horses' heads. I took the near side of the wagon to steady it. The planks creaked in a way that made counting useless. The wheels bumped at uneven joints. Halfway across, a cry came from above the trees. It was the same thin sound but stretched longer, as if someone pulled a thread past breaking. The horses raised their heads, showed teeth, and pressed against the harness. Owen kept a hand on the near bridle and spoke to them in a flat voice. I matched his pace and did not look up. The cry ended and left a hush that rang in my ears. We reached the last plank and rolled onto sand. On the far bank, the road ran beside the stream for some distance. The ground swallowed sound. We moved slower. Malin raised a hand and stopped us near a stand of cedar. On the trunk of the nearest tree, high up, were 4 grooves close together. The edges were clean. Resin had not yet set. He put his palm to the trunk below the marks and looked at the ground. There were no prints that held shape, only torn moss and scuffs. He did not speak for a time. When he did, it was to tell Owen to water the horses and then move on without delay. We followed the stream until a shallow ford came, then turned inland. The road climbed to higher sand and opened a view of scrub oak and a pale flat that caught sunlight. The light did not warm anything. We found a small hut of cedar poles near a cut in the bank where someone had hauled muck. A rake leaned against the door. No one answered when we called out. Inside, a low bed held a faded blanket. On the table lay a tin cup and a loaf gone hard. A single page torn from a ledger had 3 lines. Noise at night. Go to Tom's River. Back before thaw. The hand was hurried and sharp. Malin placed the page back where it had lain. He looked at the roofline, then at the ground behind the hut. Something had landed there. The sand showed a broad, shallow print without clear edges, as if weight had pressed down and then lifted straight up. The shape did not match any animal I knew. Ruth stood in the doorway and said, without turning, that the sound was the same as she had heard near Leeds Point when she was a girl. She said the older men had gone out with lanterns and come back without speaking to anyone. She said she did not sleep for 2 nights after that, and her father had moved the family inland the next spring. She did not say more. Owen shot a look at Mr. Hargreaves as if to say the aim of our trip needed weighing. Mr. Hargreaves kept his mouth set and told us the forge expected the nails and that the deed required a survey, not tails. The road soured again with bog smell by midday. We came to a cut with water running in a narrow channel. A log lay across as a cause. We unloaded half the wagon to lighten it, carried the chest to the far side, and returned for the rest. The horses refused the log at first. Owen steadied them and led them one at a time. When it was the wagon's turn, the rear wheel slipped and sank to the hub. We spoke low and worked the lever under the axle. The wood groaned. The wheel did not lift. The brown water crept into the spokes. There was no wind. The silence pressed on us. A shadow crossed once on the water and broke the skin. Ruth raised her eyes and then lowered them again. Malin set the lever again and told us to heave on count. We did. The wheel moved a little. The horses pulled. The wagon slid forward. Something burst from the brush at the edge of the cut. A rabbit or muskrat bolting to the far side. The movement startled me more than it should have. The wheel reached the log and then the far sand. We stood there and let our breath settle. No one spoke of the shadow. We loaded the wagon again and moved on. By late day, the trees grew thicker. A cold showed in the shade that had nothing to do with wind. We found a series of shallow pits in a grid, rimmed with moss and brick shards. Malin said it was an old bog iron dig, worked out. The ground between the pits held better than the low places. We used it. I marked bearings and times. The work steadied me. The others walked tight to the wagon without noticing. We did not spread out. A low building of clapboard appeared through the trees near dusk, with a shed behind it and a stack of cordwood to the side. Smoke did not rise. A piece of cloth hung from a nail near the door. The front latch had a simple peg. Malin called out and gave our names. No one answered. He lifted the peg and pushed. The wood scraped. Inside, the air held the smell of tallow and something sharp. The hearth had white ash. On the table lay a small book bound in pasteboard. On the first page, a hand had written dates and short notes. Child ill. Cows strayed. Heard it again. The last line read, "It knows the roof." Above the table, the rafters showed spaced holes, not from beetles, but torn. The edges were splintered with fresh pale wood. The roof boards had a spot of dried brown on one seam, small but clear. Owen traced one split and swore. He said a storm had pried it. Malin said storms did not leave clean edges like that under a roof. He set the book down and closed it. Ruth ran a finger along the spine of the book without looking at it. She said the owner had left in a hurry and might return. We left a small bundle of food on the table and a note with our names and the day. We barred the door from inside and agreed to keep a watch. First watch fell to me and Owen. We sat near the hearth without a fire. The night rose cold. The sounds were small at first. A branch settling, a strip of bark loosening, a slow drop from the gutter. A board shifted above. The sound was light, as if a hand had placed weight. then none. I looked at Owen. He looked at the ceiling. We heard the same sound again, from the other side of the roof. Then a scrape that moved along the ridge, careful and slow. It stopped above the door. The door latch lifted a fraction and fell back. The peg held. I stood and reached for the musket near the wall. It was loaded. I checked the pan without spilling. The scrape returned above the table, then above the hearth, then to the far corner where the rafters met the beam. It stopped. A thin breath came through the seam, as if air had been drawn in. I felt my chest tighten in answer. The breath ceased. For a time there was nothing. Then a sound from the yard made the hair rise on my neck. The same high cry, but now close and short, like a test. Another sound answered from farther off, lower and rougher, as if not shaped for noise. Owen's mouth opened a little and closed. We woke the others without speaking. Mr. Hargreaves sat up with a frown he did not control. Malin took his staff and moved to the window. Ruth stood near the door with her hands together, not in prayer, just steadying herself. The roof creaked once more. Something moved down the far wall outside, nails or hooves clicking softly against clapboard at slow intervals. The steps reached the ground and stopped. The window showed only our faces faint in the glass. We waited. Then a light knock came at the door, 3 small taps that did not match any human hand. Owen whispered that we should answer. Malin shook his head and pointed to the peg. The taps came again, same pattern, same measure between. They stopped. A smell reached us through the seams, iron and old wet. It filled the room and then faded. The quiet that followed had a weight. I heard the small scratch of Ruth's thumb on her other hand. Mr. Hargreaves whispered that we should not be kept by tricks and that fear would ruin the work. Nobody answered. The quiet broke with a sudden rush on the roof, a crosswise run from corner to corner, and then a heavy thud behind the house, as if something had dropped from the eave. The horses screamed from the shed, the sound cut short, not by silence, but by a hard breath from them, and then the scrape of hooves and a post hitting the ground. We unbarred the door and ran for the shed. The cold struck my face and steadied my mind. The lantern showed the nearest horse backed into the corner, eyes rolling, rope twisted around a beam. The other horse leaned hard against the opposite wall, sweating and shaking. The rear door of the shed hung open on a broken hinge. The boards along its edge were marked by the same parallel grooves we had seen on the cedar trunk, close together and deep. The marks were high. No man could reach that height without a ladder. We brought the horses out into the yard and kept them moving until their breaths eased. I ran my hands along the flanks, felt raised lines where hair had been torn. No deep wounds, but enough to show contact. Malin circled the shed once with the lantern and returned without a word. He did not need to speak. We all felt what he had seen. The prints that never held long enough for detail. The scuffed sand. The sense of passing weight. We did not sleep. We barred the house again and sat with the unloaded musket and a second one Owen primed. We kept the lantern low. The roof did not speak again. The cry did not return. In the thin hour before dawn, I closed my eyes for a count and opened them to the same room. My mind filled the pause with shapes. I kept my eyes open after that. When the sky lightened, we made ready to leave. We left the note on the table and the bundle of food. I wrote a line under our names. Roof not sound. We hitched the team and moved out without breakfast. On the road, Malin said we would cut south to the Batstow track and follow it to the forge without stopping. He did not ask for consent. No one objected. Mr. Hargreaves kept his jaw tight and his eyes forward. Owen checked the priming again and tucked the musket within easy reach near the seat. Ruth held the shawl close but did not look small. She did not glance back at the house. I did, once, and saw only a plain structure, blank as any other, with nothing to show the night except a door that no longer hung even on its hinges. The morning stayed gray and low, with a thin wind that hissed through the tops of the pines. The track narrowed and bent often, forcing us to weave between trees that leaned inward. Malin said the road was older than it looked, first cut by men who carried iron on their backs to Batstow. The sand was firmer here, mixed with gravel. The horses moved with less strain. Still, their ears flicked at every small noise. I counted our progress by the changes in light more than by distance. The sun never showed itself, but the color of the air shifted from slate to dull silver. I kept the book closed and walked beside the wagon. We reached the first fork by mid-morning. The left path showed fresh wheel marks, the right only prints of deer and raccoon. Malin knelt and studied both. He said the left ran toward the forge and the right toward abandoned cedar ground. We went left. The smell of smoke came faintly soon after, and the sound of water on rock followed. I felt a sense of order return with the sound of work ahead. The others walked faster. The road dipped once more, and then the forge pond came into view through the trees, dark and still except for the mill race. Beyond it stood the forge house, low and wide, with 2 chimneys and an open door. No one met us at first. The hammer inside stood silent. We called and waited. A boy came from behind the house, no more than 12, with a sooty face and bare feet. Mylan spoke to him. The boy said his father and the others had gone upriver 2 days before to fell timber and had not returned. He said they had heard strange sounds at night from the woods behind the slag heap. Long cries, like a woman screaming, but stretched thin and high. He said his father had told them to keep close and not answer any calls they heard after dark. He pointed to a spot near the tree line where something had burned. The sand there was black and glossy, as if heat had fused it. Mylan asked if there had been a fire. The boy said no. It had been like that one morning when they woke. No trees nearby had burned. The air had smelled of iron and wet stone. Mr. Hargreaves handed the boy a coin and told him to fetch water and oats for the horses. We led the wagon near the forge and unhitched. Owen checked the wheels and tightened the traces. Ruth went inside the house with a small loaf and looked for a place to rest. I followed Mylan to the slag heap. The ground was uneven, full of sharp black stone that cracked underfoot. In the middle of the cleared space lay the fused patch the boy had spoken of. It was round, maybe 6 feet across, smooth at the edges and still darker than the rest. A few white feathers lay caught in the cracks. Mylan knelt and touched the surface. It was cold, slick like glass. He stood and wiped his hand on his coat. He said it had not been fire that made it, and that we should leave before nightfall. We spent 2 hours unloading the nails and repacking the wagon for the return. The forge boy stayed near but did not speak more. He kept looking toward the trees. At one point, he asked if we had seen anything in the sky. Mylan said no. The boy nodded and said that sometimes, just before dark, something passed over without sound, and the geese would rise all at once. He said it never came from the same direction twice. When Owen asked if anyone had tried to shoot at it, the boy said his uncle had fired once and the gun barrel split. We said no more on it. By the time we set out again, the light had begun to fade. The air turned still, and a low mist rose from the pond. We followed the same track back, though the way seemed longer. Mylan walked faster than before. He did not wait at turns. Owen drove with one hand on the reins and the other resting near the musket. I felt the same sense I had felt before a storm, when air holds weight but no sound. Ruth hummed something faintly under her breath. It might have been a hymn, though I could not place it. As we passed the first bend, I heard a single cry behind us, distant and thin, the same sound as before but fainter, drawn out as if across distance rather than height. Mylan did not turn. He said to keep the team steady and not to stop until the trees thinned. We moved at a steady pace. The sound came again, closer, sharper, ending in a low trill that made the horses toss their heads. Owen swore softly and struck the reins. I turned once and saw movement above the trees, a dark shape gliding with its wings half-folded, turning in a slow arc. It passed over the road and vanished into the mist. It made no sound as it moved. The silence after was worse than the cry. We reached a dry stretch where the ground rose and the trees stood thinner. Mylan stopped and told us to listen. For a moment there was only wind, then another cry from farther off, deeper and lower, not like the first. It seemed to come from the direction of the forge. The boy had been alone there, and the thought settled in me with a cold weight I could not shake. Ruth crossed herself without a word. Mr. Hargreaves said we had no choice but to move on. Mylan agreed, though his tone carried doubt. We camped that night on higher ground near a stand of scrub oak. We made no fire. The horses grazed on dry grass and stayed close to the wagon. Owen kept his musket across his knees. Ruth sat with her shawl drawn up and eyes fixed on the dark. Mylan stood apart, facing the direction we had come. I could not tell if he was watching or listening. Mr. Hargreaves took notes by lantern light, though the words seemed for his own comfort rather than record. I lay with my back to the wheel and watched the sky. It held no stars. A faint glow pulsed once in the distance, low on the horizon, like sheet lightning but slower. Mylan saw it too. He said it was not lightning. No sound followed. Near midnight, the horses started. Their heads rose, ears forward, nostrils flared. A smell reached us, sharp and sour, like wet iron in decay. Owen stood with the musket raised. The sound that came next froze all movement, a slow, dragging breath drawn through the trees, as if something large moved between trunks and paused to test the air. I counted the breaths without meaning to. They grew louder, then softer, circling. Mylan motioned us to stay low. We heard a branch snap. Another breath followed, closer, then silence. The kind of silence that fills space, not emptiness, but pressure. I could feel it in my chest. A moment later, a faint scrape came from behind the wagon. Owen turned, sighted the musket, and fired. The flash lit the trees for a second. I saw nothing human or animal, only the edge of something large, a surface like leather catching light, then gone. The sound that followed was not a cry but a burst of air, high and sharp, cutting off halfway. The horses broke their lines and ran. We could not stop them. The wagon jerked once, nearly overturned. Owen shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Mylan grabbed the chest and threw it clear. The wagon tipped, spilling half our things into the sand. When it was over, the forest was silent again. The smell lingered. The horses were gone. The musket smoke hung low. I looked to where the flash had lit the trees. The sand there was disturbed in a wide circle, pressed flat, the same as near the forge. A single deep mark cut the edge, cloven, larger than any hoof I had seen. It ran for a short distance and stopped, as if whatever had made it had lifted into the air. Malin said nothing. Owen reloaded in silence, his hands shaking. Ruth's eyes stayed fixed on the place where the sound had come. Mr. Hargreaves stood with his book half open, staring at the blank page. We did not sleep that night. The dawn came slowly, a pale gray that showed the ground and the scattered things we had lost. We gathered what we could and began walking east toward the old Cedar Road, hoping to reach Leeds Point by the next day. Malin led without looking back. No one spoke for the first hour. When the trees opened a little, we saw blackbirds circling high above the direction we had come from. They moved in uneven lines, rising and falling as if following something below. We kept walking until the sound of the forge pond was too faint to hear. By midday, the land began to change. The sand grew lighter, the trees more spaced, and the air carried a faint salt smell from the east. The silence that had hung around us since the night felt thinner here, but not gone. Malin said we were within a day's walk of Leeds Point if we kept the pace. We stopped once to drink from a shallow creek. The water was cold and bitter, with an aftertaste of metal. Ruth said it reminded her of the wells near her father's farm, where the buckets sometimes came up stained orange. She drank only a mouthful. Owen said little. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and he walked with the musket always half ready. He had tied a strip of cloth around the stock where the powder had burned his hand from the last shot. Mr. Hargreaves no longer spoke of deeds or land. He had lost the careful air of ownership and walked behind us as if following rather than leading. Every so often he turned his head toward the trees, then toward the sky, as if waiting for something to come from either. By late afternoon, the sky began to thicken again with gray. The light grew weak and flat. The trees around us were shorter, with twisted trunks and patches of green moss clinging to their bases. Malin stopped to study a set of impressions in the sand. They were faint but clear enough to see, a line of prints like hooves, but with each mark set farther apart than any normal stride. The ground around them was disturbed, pressed down in long streaks, as if something had used wings to slow its landing. Malin said nothing. He stood a long time, then told us to move quickly. His voice had lost its calm. The air grew colder. I felt a heaviness in my chest, not fear exactly, but the sense that something waited nearby. The forest no longer felt empty. I could not hear footsteps other than ours, yet every pause in our walk felt filled by another presence. Even the birds were gone now. No calls, no wings, no movement. Only the scrape of our boots through the sand. Ruth whispered that she could hear breathing behind her. When I turned, there was nothing. The air hung still. She looked at me as if I should deny what she'd said. I could not. We reached the edge of a clearing before dusk. It was small, maybe 50 yards across, with a single dead oak in the center. Its bark had been stripped away in patches, showing pale wood underneath. At its base lay a carcass, what had once been a deer. The body was split open, ribs exposed, organs gone. The ground around it was torn and blackened, as if burned. Malin bent to look closer. He said the flesh was cold and dry, not fresh, yet the wound edges had no decay. The air around it smelled like iron again, sharp enough to sting the throat. Ruth turned away and began to mutter something too low to hear. Owen spat and said we should burn it. Malin said there was no time and fire would draw attention. We moved on, giving the clearing wide berth. As we entered the next stretch of woods, the light dimmed faster than it should have. The clouds overhead thickened until it felt like twilight, though it could not have been past 5. The temperature dropped sharply. The horse's absence weighed on us more now. We carried what supplies we could on our backs, the rest left behind with the wagon. I heard the first sound not long after, a short, dry click from above, like claws on bark. Owen froze and pointed his musket toward the canopy. Nothing moved, but I saw a flash of something pale among the branches, quick and small. Malin whispered for us to keep walking. He said not to stop, no matter what we heard. We did not make camp that night. Malin said we would walk until we reached the next creek and rest there with a small fire. The road wound through a narrow stretch of cedar swamp where the ground grew soft. I stepped in water up to my ankles. The smell of decay thickened. The mist returned, rolling low between the trees. The clicking sound followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes directly overhead. I could not tell its distance. Each time it stopped, I strained to hear breathing, but there was only the sound of the stream nearby and the drag of our steps. When the trees opened again, we found a rise of ground dry enough to stop. Owen built a small fire from fallen branches. The light was weak and yellow. The mist crept around us, thinning near the flame but never fully gone. Ruth sat with her knees drawn to her chest and eyes fixed on the dark. She whispered that the sound from the roof of the cabin had been the same as this, the same clicking, only slower. Mr. Hargreaves sat apart from us, the musket across his lap staring into the fog. Malin told him to rest, but he shook his head. It came just after the fire had burned low, a high, piercing cry that rose out of the mist so close it seemed within arm's reach. The sound froze every part of me. It was the same pitch and length as before, but this time it did not fade. It held, longer than breath should allow, until the air seemed to vibrate with it. The horse's absence made it worse. There was nothing to drown it out. Owen stood and raised his musket. The cry stopped at once, cut off as if severed. Silence followed, then a rush of air that bent the flames sideways. The trees around us shuddered once, though there was no wind. Something passed above. I saw the shape only for a heartbeat. Long, dark, wings stretched wide, tail curled, moving faster than the eye could follow. It vanished into the mist ahead. The fire guttered. Ruth began to whisper a prayer. Malin took the musket from Owen and said in a calm voice that we would not fire again unless it came close enough to strike. He said noise would draw it back. The cry came again, farther away now, circling. Each time it sounded, the horses we no longer had seemed to echo in my mind, as if they would have reared and screamed if they'd been there. Malin said to move. We left the fire burning low and pushed east, guided by the faintest trace of starlight through the fog. My legs felt weak, but movement kept my mind steady. Behind us, something broke through the branches with a sharp crack. I looked back and saw nothing, but the sound of wings came again. One heavy beat, then another, then silence. By the time the first gray light of morning came, the trees had thinned, and we saw the outline of salt meadows in the distance. Leeds Point was still hours away, but the land felt less closed. The air smelled of the sea. Malin said we would rest once we reached the dunes. We stopped near a stand of dry reeds. The wind there felt like real wind again, cold but alive, not the still weight of the forest. I lay back on the sand and stared at the sky. For a brief moment, I thought we had left it behind. Then Ruth pointed upward. Far off, just at the edge of the clouds, a dark shape circled once, twice, and then folded its wings and dropped straight down into the pines where we had come from. No cry followed, only the wind over the reeds and the steady roll of the tide beyond the trees. Malin said nothing. He watched until the shape was gone, then turned toward the road. We walked the last stretch in silence. By nightfall, we reached the first cottages of Leeds Point. Smoke rose from their chimneys, and the sight of it felt almost strange. People stared as we came in, covered in sand and dirt. An old man outside the tavern saw Malin and nodded. He asked if we had come from the inland road. Malin said yes. The man said, "Then you've heard it too." He looked toward the woods. "It's been crying near the bogs 3 nights now." The miller's boy saw it fly across the moon. We stayed the night in the tavern's loft. None of us spoke much. Mr. Hargreaves tried once to write, but stopped and folded the paper away. Owen slept with his musket beside him. Ruth kept her shawl pulled to her face and did not close her eyes until dawn. When I finally slept, I dreamed of trees bending without wind and the sound of wings scraping against bark. In the morning, we left for Burlington. Malin led again, quieter than before. None of us spoke about what we had seen. But when the town finally disappeared behind us and the pines closed in again, I noticed Malin glancing up more often than forward. Each time a shadow crossed the path, his hand went to the staff. He never said it aloud, but I could tell he knew, as I did, that whatever haunted those woods had not stayed behind. We never returned to that part of the pines. The forge was later abandoned, the road fell into disuse, and the maps changed. Years later, I still hear that sound in my memory, that long, thin cry that cuts through every other noise. I have never heard it again with my ears, but sometimes, when the wind runs low and the trees grow still, I remember how it rose and held, and how it ended, as if the air itself had been torn apart.